All right, thank you very much, Marcos. It's really a pleasure to be with you in this series. Just want to start by mentioning that TRACIT addresses all forms of illicit trade, not just counterfeiting, for example. So we're looking at illicit trade in alcohol, tobacco, falsified medicines, wildlife trade, petroleum, a long list of things. And we also address, where the supply chain might be vulnerable to exploitation. So we would be looking at illicit trade in maritime channels through small parcels and also on online platforms. So really what I'm talking to you about today is that intersection of counterfeiting and online platforms. So again, thanks for the opportunity to participate in this talk series. And basically, in preparing for this, I thought there might be, say, 4 key messages or 4 topics that I think you might find of interest. I think that would be relevant to Mercado Libre, but also to all platforms, all e-commerce platforms out there from whatever region or whatever country that are facing the same challenges. So those 4 topics in advance are corporate social responsibility, otherwise known as CSR. I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about fraud, seller verification, and lastly, investments. So that's a little bit of an outline for today's conversation. So let's just get into it. CSR is a favorite topic of mine. It's an important topic, I think, for any business or business association. It's really what consumers, what the world has come to expect from business these days. And I think that, for me at least, when I was approached by you to participate in this series, I felt like that this was a sign that Mercado Libre was ready to engage at a much higher level on public relations and letting the world know what you're doing or the challenges that you're facing. But I also think in doing that it brings a level of accountability to you, to your company, for raising the bar in this area. And I think what the bar is, or what we're all hoping to achieve, or at least what I would expect, is a simple line here that we've been talking about for a long time, and that is that consumers are entitled to an online shopping experience that is safe and secure from fraud. And, I know we're talking about counterfeiting today, but, counterfeiting is a subset of fraud, and I'm going to jump into that a little bit later. But, where we are right now is that, online suppliers need to make sure that, your platforms comply with the same long-established regulations that govern all kinds of commercial transactions. I mean, that's what the world has come to expect here in 2021. But that's not the case, really. And I think that's why the title of your talk is called Prevention Talks, because you and others are aware that online platforms are full of fakes and outright fraudulent products. We all know this. We all know this has to change, and that's why we're putting our minds together. That's why we're looking for collaborative solutions, so that we can create a business model that works not just this year, next year, but for the generations to come, because clearly the writing on the wall is that e-commerce is everyone's future. So the question there becomes, what can business do this on its own, businesses like yours, or will businesses need to be regulated? I know that's the debate that's going on in Brussels, in Europe. That's the debate that's going on in Washington, D.C., in the United States. In my opinion, I think business can be the solution. I don't think regulations are necessarily the solution, but I think for businesses to be able to solve the problem without regulations means that they need to genuinely be willing to get ahead of the curve. And it's my hope that in fact is what Mercado Libre is hoping to do with this prevention series. And I think, if I can be allowed to dream a little bit. Wouldn't it be great if Mercado Libre jumped in front of all the other platforms? What if it was you that raised the bar? What if it was you that fundamentally changed the game on topics like fraud prevention, consumer protection, seller verification? In the business that I'm in, we work closely with many UN agencies, including the UN Global Compact. 8,000 companies are committed. I picked out, they're committed to better corporate social responsibility. And there's a long list of things they're committed to. But one of the provisions that I'd like to point to here is that, let's prove the point that principles and profits go hand in hand. So those principles are, to me, consumer protection. When I talk about, getting ahead of the curve, let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Let's take the case of the automobile industry, a massive industry, not unlike where e-commerce is going now. Some of the world's biggest corporations, some of the world's biggest, most trusted brands have been automakers. And I think that's what's happening now with the e-commerce and social media platforms. You're getting into a place where you are looked at with trust from your consumers. But let me take you back in time a little bit to make my point. The case of seat belts and airbags in the cars. In the old days, these car makers, these trusted brands, some of the biggest companies in the world, they all resisted seat belts and airbags. Can you imagine that now? They argued that the cost of the technology was too high and that installing them would raise the price of the vehicle. They argued that this would reduce sales. It would hurt their public image because somehow the public would think that their products were dangerous if they had to have an airbag installed. And, at that time, which when I think back about this and read some of the stories, it's almost impossible to believe that they put forward a list of reasons to defend these positions. I mean, they made cases they pointed out cases that airbags didn't always save passengers in car crashes, so therefore they don't need to install them. Or they argued that the airbag wouldn't work on children, or that when the airbag was deployed, it would release poisonous gases. So, I mean, they were putting forth arguments to somehow put off the inevitable, that consumer safety would prevail. And the inevitable happened in 1983, and at least in the United States, the government mandated the use of seatbelts and airbags. I mean, this is exactly what we're talking about right now. Can corporations get ahead and protect consumers because that's what their business model is? That's what they consider to be good corporate social responsibility? Or do you wait for the regulation? In any case, once those regulations came in, it ended decades of fighting and battling and lobbying the car companies, who then in turn fully embraced consumer safety as a selling point, and it became a marketing tool. And as anyone who watches a television commercial now, most automakers are very proud of and promote, their investments in technologies that put consumers and their users first. So I think, this was the first point that I wanted to make, is that the future of shopping is e-commerce. Your company and all the other platforms, perhaps some of them that might be watching today, need to take a good look at the business model that they want to be known for, and determine whether or not they can be the leading company that's out in front of regulation. So the second thing that I want to talk to you about is the concept of fraud. And really, I'm hoping to tell a story with these 4 points that when we're done, perhaps can set a new paradigm for platforms moving forward. And what I want to talk, when I talk about fraud, I really want to talk about IP first. intellectual property. And if you look at some of the major battles and lawsuits over the last 10 years or so, the primary protagonists, the ones that have complaints with e-commerce platforms, have been brand owners, not the consumers so much. I think the consumers are behind the curve. They're looking at convenience and low price and not seeing some of the hazards online the same way that a brand owner or an intellectual property rights holder might see. Because, as I mentioned at the top of the conversation, and as we all know, counterfeiters are abusing weaknesses in the platforms like yours, to post listings of counterfeits. So what you've had is this evolution where companies that have been protecting their intellectual property rights from counterfeiters for years and years, all of a sudden we're confronted with a new way that products are being sold, being e-commerce, and they shifted their approach to protecting IP, their toolkit for raids and stopping the unfair competition to the platforms. They've asked for your help. They've gone to you and with notices and requests for takedown and other tools to try to clean up the platform. And I think, just to share what I hope is perhaps a slightly different perspective, I think we've kind of gotten into a position, a bit of a vicious circle, a do loop, if you will, because the response of the platforms have been to provide tools like notice and takedowns, or programs where brand owners can search and try to find products. It's not really their problem. These listings of fake versions that they don't manufacture, they don't advertise, they don't ship, they don't store, they don't collect revenues for. So I think that in many cases, this focus on, the tools for addressing notice and takedown has come from the wrong place. We're looking at stopping something that's already online because of the approach by the companies, as opposed to making sure that we know who's selling our products. Because in many ways, and I don't want to say it's not a responsibility of the users of the platform. Certainly, it's not saying it's not a responsibility of brand owners to try to monitor where fake versions of their products are being sold. But I think it's understanding that the problem is much bigger than IP. And therefore, the solutions need to be much bigger than IP. The problem that we're confronting is more and more products and more sellers from every corner of the world come online, is, can we protect consumers from fraud? I mean, we're asking questions when we talk about notice and takedown of an IP infringement, well, is the trademark registered, et cetera, et cetera. What I'm getting at is that we need to look at this problem as a source of fraud to consumers. What if we're looking into IP rights, should we not also be looking at the bigger question of, does a product that comes online from a seller who wishes to use your platform, do those products meet the environmental controls? I mean, in other words, is that manufacturer, dumping chemical waste out behind the factory? Is that being looked into? Are these sellers, do we know if these sellers are using forced labor or child labor to make the products? Do we know that product safety standards have been met? For example, especially for electronic components, or any sort of a food, or any product that goes on your face or in your body. Those products have all been, over years and decades, subject to consumer safety provisions and more recently environmental and labor law provisions. So I think what I want to do is, I wanted to put this topic out there for conversation that in many ways it's not just about IP. And I think what the platforms need to do is they need to take a broader, higher approach to what is it that they want. How far are you willing to go? What do you think is your responsibility for ensuring that users that come to a platform like yours are protected from consumer fraud? The third topic that I'd like to discuss today is the topic of seller verification. So, there are a portfolio of tools that are available. Mercado Libre certainly provides, certain tools primarily focused in notice and takedown. I think, hopefully what you've gained from what I've said so far is that we need to shift our focus really away from tracking down listings once they're already on a platform to keeping them off the platform. And in my view, supplier verification is essential. And I actually think it's easier and lower cost than the efforts and the expenditures by platforms and by brand owners, to try to track down a fraudulent listing once it's already up. I'm not the only one who thinks this. Certainly, the rights holders have looked at this as a priority for the platforms. And I think that certainly legislators, lawmakers in the U.S. have shifted the focus from responsive measures to preventive measures. And at least two of the pieces of legislation that are on Capitol Hill right now in the U.S. focus on verifying and vetting the suppliers and the sellers. And there's a good reason that most legislation is looking at the preventive measures. Let's look at this. Let's talk about this from a numbers game, for example. On most platforms, there are hundreds of thousands of sellers. In some cases, in the bigger platforms, millions of sellers. And these sellers are creating billions of listings, if not more. So let me ask you, which would you rather chase? I can tell you that if it was my job, I would rather be trying to sort through millions of sellers to try to find fraudulent activity rather than chasing down billions of listings once they're already up. So if we can break that number down even further, because in most cases, the sellers are legitimate sellers. In most cases, the sellers have legitimate verified relationships with the platforms. So you can quickly start to chop down the number of sellers that you have to be concerned about. So if we concentrate on who and not what, we can quickly narrow down the scope and certainly the magnitude of the problem by focusing in on who the bad sellers are. I think that in this case, I have an example here that I wanted to talk about because, like, if we go back to the car analogy that I was mentioning earlier, right now there is pushback from the platforms. Is it possible to get legitimate information from sellers? Is it possible to verify them? Maybe the seller is a small business that doesn't have a license. Maybe they are from a country that has different rules. What if they don't have a government ID? There are all these questions that sound hauntingly familiar to what we heard in the seatbelt argument. But I think that this can be done. And I think if we shift away from chasing billions and trillions of listings and focusing on hundreds of thousands or even millions of suppliers, that we've got a better chance. And there's an excellent model, I think, that shows that this can be done, and it has to do with drawing from the area of food security. And in the United States, for example, there's a government agency called the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. And basically what we have in the US is there are 100 to 200,000 foreign suppliers of food into the US food market, and these suppliers all come from 200 countries, as many as 200 countries worldwide. So that means that, you know, there's a wide variety of the types of sellers, the wide variety of the types of food, a wide variety of the government regulations that might apply to that supplier in their home country. It's truly an international challenge, perhaps not on the same magnitude as e-commerce, what e-commerce is facing right now, but it shows that there are similar situations where foreign suppliers are hoping to sell their product into another market. And there are regulations in the US to ensure that those suppliers provide that food that enters the market is safe, that consumer safety is accounted for. There's a lot of names of programs that I'm not going to get into, but they all require significant amount of documentation, verification, avenues for recourse if fraudulent activity is discovered. And all of these regulations and rules certainly haven't stopped, you know, U.S. import of food from foreign suppliers. In fact, the number of foreign suppliers of food into the U.S. market is increasing. Now, I'm just going to read this list here real quickly because importers need to maintain records, or sellers, platforms, distributors in the US that import the food need to maintain records from these suppliers. And here's what they have to have on hand, and they have to make it available within 24 hours upon request. But it's a hazardous analysis of the product, foreign supplier approval, foreign supplier performance evaluation, foreign supplier approval procedures, verification activities, performance of verification activities. It's a long list of things. And I think what I'm trying to get at is that I don't think we should be looking at third-party suppliers or seller vetting and verification as the impossible task. It's clearly something that can be achieved. It's been achieved in other sectors. It will be required down the line. And is there an opportunity for platforms to get ahead of things, to find solutions to how you would deal with, verify, and vet a supplier who comes from another country, regardless of, you know, what those local regulatory frameworks might be? I think if some of the big brands like yours expect to be a global brand, a household name, trusted by consumers, these are the types of things that need to be in your business plan. It needs to be part of your status quo, part of everyday operating procedures. Okay, so thanks again, Marcos. The last topic that I'd like to talk to you about is investment. So we've been laying out, you know, the problem, characterizing it as fraud, looking at some solutions like seller verification. Let's talk about investment, right? So where's the next step? You know, company policies, terms of reference, those are all good things, but let's get down to the brass tacks, right? Let's talk about investment. Where do you need to invest? You know, clearly all one has to do is open the newspaper, that dates me a little bit. Go online, look at your news feed, and you'll see that on e-commerce platforms are extremely profitable, which means that you do have resources to invest. So let's talk about where you invest. I think anyone who's has studied business at university knows that the best corporations, the most innovative, are usually those who plow their earnings back into research and development. And it's that constant cycle of selling, profiting, and reinvesting to improve and innovate is what makes companies succeed. So let's try that model on a little bit for the e-commerce platforms. Let's talk about investment in marketplaces, investment in people, and investment in people. So marketplace. So I think everything I've read and heard from most of the big platforms is that they realize their platform is evolving, that what we're looking at is creating a marketplace for other sellers, is the growth in most areas. And some of the platforms at least are realizing this and seeing the need to invest to grow a suite of tools so that in particular that small and medium-sized enterprises, for example, can easily find ways to get onto the platform, to market their materials, to advertise. And I think that as I'm seeing this investment in encouraging third parties to use the marketplace, I think an equal amount of investment needs to go into exactly what we've been talking about above, is to make sure that when those SMEs or when those businesses from one of 150 different countries, come to you and want to use your platform, that you also invest in verifying who they are and in vetting them if they have a poor track record. So I think that's what I want to say. I think there's where you need to invest. It's not just about growing the marketplace, but it's also ensuring that the marketplace has the proper controls that are going to, serve you well over the next decades. The other thing I want to talk about in terms of investment is perhaps focusing on customer service more so than notice and takedown. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. I know that all of the platforms are saying to the public, listen, what we're doing is we've got 1,000, 5,000, 10,000. We have thousands of people now that work on brand protection and anti-fraud, anti-counterfeiting. The question to me is, where are those? That's a significant investment. Where are those people being deployed? Are they being deployed in surfing the web, surfing your platform, trying to find, the counterfeits amongst billions of listings? What I think is interesting would be consider the case of the false negative. In other words, if you invest more in preventive measures and risk profiling, knowing who your customer is, keeping those products off in advance of the listing, certainly we risk a takedown, for example, or preventing a seller coming online who's actually a legitimate seller. Okay? No one wants, if I'm a small business, I wouldn't want you to take down my listings because your algorithms incorrectly identified me as a counterfeiter. However, I think if you have thousands of people that are working on counterfeiting, perhaps they could be deployed for customer service. Because as soon as my website or my product listing was taken down wrongly, I'm going to be contacting you immediately, more quickly even than a company who's unaware that their brand is being counterfeited on your site. So if more investment in time and people were spent to customer service, in other words, protecting against the false negative and providing customer service immediately to those who have suffered from a false negative, then that would free up your ability to invest in and more widely use preventive measures and risk profiling and takedowns in advance of a listing. So those are just some thoughts that I wanted to share in terms of where your investment should be targeted. Marcos, that really concludes everything I wanted to share with you today. Let me thank you once again for inviting me to the prevention talks. I certainly hope that some of my messages can take root, maybe stimulate people to think a little bit differently about this problem. I'm super confident that your company, that other platforms can do the right thing, that can find ways to prevent fraud and ensure that consumers have a secure and safe shopping experience online. So hopefully I've been able to contribute to that. And once again, I thank you very much.